The first thing you should know is that when the image popped up on my phone, my whole world tilted in a way I didn't know how to steady. There was no slow buildup, no warning, just a grainy looped clip from my backyard camera and two dogs that were not mine circling my Australian shepherd like predators circling a wounded animal. And in the time it took me to breathe the phone out, I was already dialing my husband with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. If you had asked me an hour earlier whether my dogs were safe in our fenced backyard, I would have said yes, with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from years of routine. Gates that close and latch, a fence that has stood for seasons, a neighborhood where most of us know each other's names and the sound of each other's laughter. I had put them out like I always did when it was pretty and I had errands to run. I could have left them inside. I knew that. And the knowledge now feels like a lead weight in my chest. One of those small decisions that turns into a life I don't recognize. I remember the dog I lost in such vivid, silly details that they slice right through the shock. How he'd steal the biggest ice cube and carry it like treasure. How he'd insist on paying the ice tax, a paw on your shin until you surrendered a fragment of your drink. How he'd press his head into my knee at night like he was trying to make sure I wasn't going anywhere. He was the largest of the three, but tenderest in the quiet moments. He loved me with a kind of uncomplicated intensity that made me soft around the edges. And the way he used to look at my daughters when they got home from school is a private movie I keep replaying because it's all I have left. I remember thinking as the camera's timestamp flicked across the corner of the screen that I could rewind, that maybe if I could step back, I would see a fluke, a misunderstanding, a neighbor's dogs chasing each other, and a scare that ended with everyone alive. I watched the video again, and this time I swear to you, I could hear the thud of my own heartbeat, the sound of the screen filling with the thing I didn't want to be true. My dog down on the grass, still, and the other two dogs pawing and snapping, then one of them walking away like nothing had happened. My husband pulled into the driveway and we ran to the gate together, two adults tripping over our words. Call 911, animal control, don't touch anything. And by the time we got to him, he was already gone. There was no dramatic last breath, just the quietness of something that stops being alive, and a silence so heavy I felt it in my ribs. My daughters found out because I told them, and the way they folded in on themselves is a grief I don't wish on anyone. I have no experience that fits neatly into the vocabulary the internet gives us for a moment like this. It's not tragic in the way headlines use the word. It's a rawness that rearranges everything that follows. I didn't know how it happened, how two dogs not mine could have gotten into my yard when the gates always stayed closed. So I did what any person who wanted answers does. I went to the cameras. The footage was maddeningly precise because of its impartiality. It showed a neighbor's dog, one I recognized from the way it sat on the porch, the one everyone called Rex, sauntering through a gap under a side gate, a piece of the fence that had been chewed at the bottom for months and that I had complained about more than once. There was footage showing the mechanism. A loose latch at my neighbor's side of the fence had been hanging, the latch that keeps him in his yard. It wasn't dramatic, nothing jumped through the fence so much as it was neglect given permission. The dogs that killed my Aussie simply wandered where someone else's inattention allowed them to wander. You can feel righteous anger boil into something like obsessive clarity. This is how it started for me. The instinct was not just to mourn, but to fix, to make it right in some way that matched the wrong. So I did the thing that seems reasonable at first. I went over and knocked on their door. I remember thinking I'd get an apology, a stunned, oh my God, and a neighborly helping hand. Instead, I got excuses. "Oh, those dogs have never done anything like that before," the neighbor said, folding his arms in a way that made him look smaller to me and somehow larger in his arrogance. He was careful with his words, like he was choosing the ones least likely to stain his image. I felt the conversation fall flat, polite but empty, like when people say, "I'm sorry for your loss," and there's nothing behind the words. He shrugged and he mouthed accident, as if responsibility was something that could be shrugged out of existence. He didn't bring up fixing the fence. He didn't ask if we needed help. And when I asked him if I could see his dog, he made a show of apologizing again and then closing the door with a click that echoed. I want you to imagine what that feels like. Delivering the worst news to someone and watching them tuck it away like a newspaper, folding it until the ink smudges. I wanted him to feel the impact of what had happened, but I also wanted something more tangible: accountability. Dogs are animals, people protest, and I understand to everyone that the moment was not premeditated cruelty. Still, there is a spectrum between an accident and negligence. And watching that man's body language shift to avoidance right after my child's dog had been killed tore at me in a way that anger, at times, seems reserved for betrayals by humans. He had failed in the smallest, most human ways, failing to secure his animals, failing to respond with any human warmth, failing to recognize that something was broken that he had the power to fix. I decided then that I would not let his indifference be the last narrative move in this story. So the revenge I started to plot in my head was not about tearing his life apart. I refused to be the person who retaliates with violence, because that would have been two tragedies instead of one: the loss of an animal and a life consumed by a criminal act. No, my revenge had to be something steadier, harsher, and rooted in the thing he valued most: the community, his reputation, the small-town kind of respect that masks the rot underneath. If I'm honest, there was also a selfishness to it. I wanted to make him understand the weight of what his negligence had cost us. Be honest, would you have waited this long for payback? What would you have done in my shoes? I started with the things that make the factual story unmistakable. I called animal control. It was a bureaucratic tangle at first, paperwork filled out by hand, forms that asked for details that felt like cold surgery on a wound. They came, recorded the scene, took notes, and told me the process could take time. They also, to my relief, photographed the chewed place under the fence at my neighbor's side, and they took statements. But statements on their own are thin paper against a man's indifference. So I went back to the footage and I started to catalog everything. I timestamped, I labeled, I copied clips and sent them to my lawyer friend who owed me a favor from an old college weekend. I took the quiet legal steps first because I wanted to be untouchable, to make certain that when I pushed from a place of evident truth, not rage. The next phase was social and, in a way, the one that felt dirtiest to me at first. I began to talk to neighbors, not to poison them against him, not with the crude vindictiveness people think of when they use the word revenge, but to make the narrative known, to make it impossible for him to fold it into the cardboard of just one of those things. I found that our small world had been a mosaic of small complaints. His dogs had wandered before. There had been a dog fight 2 years ago. Someone mentioned an incident kids had been scared by a loose dog last summer. People had filed things away in their private drawers. Suddenly, my tragedy combined those pieces with sharp edges. There's something about truth made visible that shifts the social axis. I started a petition, simple, asking the Homeowners Association to require proper containment, a repair, and professional training for identified dogs. I made copies of the camera footage, burned it on a disc, and handed it to the HOA board with a calmness that surprised me. I remember looking at the faces there, some sympathetic, some skittish, one man who wouldn't look me in the eye, and thinking that the smallest administrative systems can be weapons when wielded precisely. What I hadn't expected was the way the neighbor pivoted. Vulnerable people often retreat or lash out. He chose a different tack. He tried to reclaim the narrative with performative apologies on social media, messages about heartbreaking accident and deep regret, and photos of his own sad face.
The internet is a strange place where contrition can be staged for maximum sympathy. It was a move that initially might have deflected scrutiny. I saw the post and felt a bile rise because the tone was polished to perfection. So my plan evolved. If he wanted the public stage, I would make sure the full footage and facts were also public, but with care and dignity. aiming not to humiliate so much as to insist on truth. I met with the local paper. I wasn't seeking sensationalism. I wanted the record, the kind of reporting that sits in a library and doesn't evaporate. The reporter listened, asked the right stubborn questions, and when the piece ran, it laid out the timeline, included quotes from animal control, and documented the fence's disrepair. The neighbor called it character assassination. I called it documentation. There were pitfalls. People warned me about appearing vindictive. My own family worried that I was pouring my grief into a campaign against a man and that it would alienate us from neighbors who might side with him. There were nasty, anonymous notes left on our porch, words scratched that made me shiver with the knowledge that in a town small enough to be familiar, cruelty finds its bulletin board. For a while, the line between pursuit of justice and preoccupation blurred, and I had to check myself in honest silence. Was I doing this for my dog, for my daughters, or for myself? The answer mattered because it shaped the methods I allowed. I kept a ledger of every action, every call made to authorities, every person I spoke to, and I kept reminding myself that the revenge I wanted had to leave me intact at the end. I refused to break the law, to stoop to theft or arson or violence. The world of legal recourse, public pressure, and community watchdogging is messy and slow, but it also builds a wall of evidence that an indifferent neighbor cannot easily ignore. One of the deepest betrayals wasn't the neighbor's initial negligence, though that wound was loud. It's the way institutions can sometimes be slow to move. Animal control said the case would be reviewed. The HOA took weeks to convene a hearing. The neighbor's lawyer called a meeting and proposed a restorative conversation in which they suggested fencing repairs and a donation to a local shelter. It sounded reasonable until the details made my teeth hurt. They suggested a donation amount so trivial it felt like salt in the wound and offered to make things right without acknowledging loss. It's in those little gestures that people test your limits. At the hearing, I spoke. I told the room about the ice cubes, the way my dog would fall asleep with his head on my foot, about my daughters and how they counted on him like a compass. I watched the neighbor sit there, fat with a transcript of excuses, and I felt a satisfaction like a hot coal in my palm when the truth landed in the room and would not be shrugged away. The HOA issued an order: secure the fence, keep the dogs contained, and comply with mandatory training and microchipping. The neighbor said he would. He didn't. He did a half-hearted job, left an inch of opening, and pretended the problem solved itself. The system's teeth were blunt when people are determined to play games. I began to document every non-compliance. I recorded, with the discreet professionalism I had learned from being in the workforce, each incident of the neighbor's dogs near my fence, each time they were out without leashes, each time someone else's child reported being scared. I kept dates, times, notes from witnesses. My daughters gave statements. My husband took pictures. I took everything to the county and to animal control, and this time the response had more force. A threatened fine, a mandated hearing, the potential for criminal citation if the neighbor persisted. You should know that the path of bureaucratic fight is unglamorous. It is forms and waiting rooms and the steady compounding of evidence until the law's structure can bear down on the person who refuses to do the obvious. There were moments when I wanted to scream at the bureaucracy, to demand swifter justice. But each small administrative victory felt like a notch in a belt. Not every revenge is swift. Many are little victories assembled into something final. During this time, I felt my own inner life shifting. Grief became a companion, with a voice that was sometimes reasonable and sometimes ferocious. I would catch myself replaying the images in relief, and I had to develop strategies to keep from unraveling. My daughters and I went to therapy together, and the counselor, sharp and soft at once, helped us name emotions and allowed restitution into our lives, if only as a theoretical end. If you are watching and thinking, this doesn't feel like revenge yet, hold on. There's a long, incinerating middle where you try every right way to make it right and get blocked at each turn by someone pretending the universe owes them the benefit of the doubt. It is in that prolonged thwarting that revenge grows not as spectacle, but as methodical correction. One of the most difficult parts was the sense that the neighbor was performing being a good neighbor for those who hadn't looked closely. He mowed his lawn on weekends in a way that suggested care. He waved at people at the hardware store. He took his children to soccer. But there we were with the film and the orders and the threadbare attempts at compliance. There was a collision of two narratives, his practiced normalcy and our fractured truth. I decided the only way to break through was to expose the discrepancy without cruelty. I started a small, community-focused campaign, safety meetings at the park, a free seminar on responsible pet ownership organized through the library, flyers about containment requirements and the emotional cost of negligence. Quiet, educational, and impossible to oppose on principle. When he protested that I was going public, I didn't deny it. I wanted the public to know the truth so they could make informed choices. If shame is a blunt instrument, information is surgical. There were close calls. Once when I was picking up my younger daughter from the bus stop, one of his dogs, despite the mandates in place, wandered up the road and sat in the curb while cars zipped past. I felt my heart stop. It could have been a child. It could have been anyone. I yelled, I approached, and I managed, with a calmness I borrowed from the therapist, to coax the dog away until help arrived. My husband wanted to retaliate more directly. We argued in the kitchen about how far to push. He wanted to paint a message on the neighbor's garage. I wanted to keep our hands clean. We resolved it by filing another complaint. It felt like a moral line we refused to cross. Vengeance that damages people physically is not the same as justice. My husband and I were both haunted by what we had lost, and the tension between the desire for immediate retribution and the steadier path of legal accountability became a recurring conversation. Be honest. If it were you, would you have been able to keep your hands to yourself? The pressure built until one late autumn morning when animal control showed up with a citation and a fine and the threat of an aggravated misdemeanor if the neighbor failed to comply again. The community had rallied in small ways: signatures on petitions, a few op-eds in the paper, a local radio host who interviewed me and asked questions that validated my loss. The neighbor reacted as I had expected. He reacted with denial at first and then with anger. He hung signs in his yard claiming harassment and false accusations. I felt myself becoming the villain in the distorted mirror he held up to justify his behavior. But the law and the documentation had weight, and slowly the narrative tilted. The county scheduled a hearing, the kind of small administrative trial where evidence is admitted and the tone is more procedural than dramatic. The neighbor showed up with his lawyer, who tried to undermine credibility by asking about my alleged campaign against him. Resistance, in a way, confirmed we were doing the right thing. When a person fights to avoid responsibility, the fight itself proves the stakes. And then came the most wrenching moment. The hearing included testimony from a neighbor I'd never spoken to before, a woman who had been hesitant to speak out, but who had, after my campaign, found solace in our community meetings and decided to tell the truth about an incident where her child's toy had been chewed by a wandering dog.
She spoke with a voice that cracked, and in that moment, all the diffuse irritants and rumor collapsed into the human cost. The hearing officer didn't mince words. She fined the neighbor, ordered permanent structural repairs to the fences, and required professional animal behavior intervention. It was not the cinematic fall I had once imagined in my more furious fantasies,
But it was a real, enforceable series of consequences. The neighbor's life would be shifted by paperwork and price tags, by the knowledge that he'd been recorded and that the community now watched. He grumbled, told anyone who'd listen that I had ruined him, but the law had done its job. That was my revenge. The transformation of negligence into accountability, the replacement of shrugging indifference with responsibility that had cost him something. But even with the legal victory, I knew the heartache didn't go away. There were no reinstatements of the life I had with my dog. The finality of death is its own kind of silence, and I grieved in private after the legal dust settled. Yet there was a small, essential satisfaction in watching a man acknowledge in writing that his inattention had consequences. There is a dignity to that. My daughters began to sleep longer without that catch in their breaths at night. They began to laugh again, small peals that feel like permission to live. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on the back steps where we used to give the dogs treats, and I tell the story aloud to an empty lawn. Because speaking the truth has been a balm. I kept the petty parts of myself from ruling our actions. I refused to let my grief calcify into cruelty. The revenge that saved me from myself was the one that insisted the truth be heard and the law be applied evenly. There were consequences I didn't expect. The community divided in small, painful ways. The neighbor had allies who felt I went too far, who believed accidents happen and no one is wholly culpable. There were friends I hadn't expected to lose because they found my persistence uncomfortable. That part of the story is important because it reveals the cost of standing for accountability. Sometimes you stand alone, and sometimes you lose the soft edges of relationships that prefer complacency. But the new alliances I formed, people who had also been hurt by negligence, who wanted a safer neighborhood for their children and pets, felt truer. We organized a neighborhood watch, not to spy or shame, but to help one another maintain safety and build fences, literally and figuratively. We put on workshops about responsible ownership and raised funds for low-cost spay, neuter, and training programs. What began as revenge slowly seeded community resilience, and I think that matters. The best vendettas convert anger into boundary setting, into structures that prevent the same harm from slipping into someone else's life. I would be lying if I said I never fantasized about more dramatic outcomes. The neighbor on his knees, Shakespearean remorse dripping from his confession. But life rarely writes its climaxes that neatly. Instead, the catharsis arrived in fragments. The hearings ruling, the neighbor finally hiring a professional trainer, the sight of my daughters playing in our yard again without flinching. Those slow pieces added up into something like repair. There were nights when I woke in the dark and whispered the dog's name, and those nights still come sometimes, sharp as glass, but they have softened over time into a tender ache rather than a raw bleeding wound. I learned that some losses we don't get over so much as we move with them, like carrying a stone in your pocket. Cumbersome, yes, but part of you. I let myself grieve without the pretense of quick recovery, and I learned to answer my daughter's questions with honesty, tailored to their age, but with the full emotional truth, that grief is allowed. The revenge I enacted did not resurrect what I had lost, but it did make a world where other people might not have to face the same senselessness. If you're sitting with me now, maybe you're thinking about what you would have done, and that's a good question to hold. Would you have filed the complaints? Would you have pushed for a hearing? Would you have sought a quieter, restorative approach or something louder and more punitive? There is not one moral route through grief, but I will tell you what helped me keep my feet under me. Being methodical, gathering evidence,
seeking legal recourse, and channeling the raw energy of anger into community action that had an ethical spine. I am not proud of the nights I dreamed of petty revenge, of leaving a note on his car or painting something on his fence. Those impulses were human and ugly and quick. What I am proud of is that in the end, I chose to make a system respond, because systems, unlike people, can carry the burden of accountability in a structured way. That choice left me standing rather than consumed. People often ask whether I forgave him. Forgiveness is a personal thing, not an obligation. I moved from wanting him to feel the pain I felt to wanting him to be safe enough that he would not inflict that negligence on anyone else. That change from retribution to prevention was the real turning point. It doesn't excuse him, it simply moves the story into a place where grief produces care. If you ever find yourself in a similar position, my advice is this: document. Speak calmly but persistently, and don't let anyone tell you that grief must be silent. Justice is sometimes dull and slow and ugly, but when it works, it does not reduce a life. It restores a basic measure of safety. The world we live in isn't a movie where every wrong gets theatrical punishment. Sometimes the only revenge that matters is the one that makes the world marginally better for the next person. On the worst days, my daughters and I still set out an extra bowl of water in the backyard, almost as an offering, and I still catch myself reaching for the leash on old habit. There are good dogs now that have wandered into our lives at different times, offering small, conditional comforts, and I have learned to accept them without pretending they're replacements. We commemorate our dog in quiet ways: a photo on the mantle, a plaque that says "Beloved," and these little acts of remembrance matter more than any satisfaction the neighbor might have lost. In the end, the revenge I enacted taught me something unexpected: that power doesn't always mean making someone suffer. Sometimes it means making sure the truth is known, that systems act, and that you, broken and hurting, refuse to disappear into someone else's silence. The neighbor repaired his fence, eventually, and the dogs were microchipped and trained. He continues to live in our town. On some mornings, I see him in the grocery aisle, and we nod like two people who share a difficult history. I will never get back what I lost, and that truth sits in me like a bell that tolls at odd hours. But there is comfort in knowing I did what I could to make sure the accident that took him doesn't become someone else's normal. So, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have stopped at grief, or would you have pushed for the slow, bureaucratic corrections that feel less satisfying but last longer? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback, knowing that payback could mean courts, hearings, and the possibility of losing friends along the way? If your answer is yes, then you understand why I woke up furious and then learned to be strategic. If your answer is no, then maybe you also see how grief can make strange companions of us all. There is no single right reaction to loss, but there is dignity in insisting that negligence be met with consequence, in refusing to let your pain be folded away into a neighbor's neat apology. We honored him in the best way we could, by telling the truth, by making the community safer, and by reminding ourselves every day that love means accountability.